Hi everyone, it's January the 20th, 2025. I'm Andy Oakley and welcome to my new podcast, Andy Oakley Investigates. Well, it's February again in New Zealand, and this time every year the racism hits peak woke as the Maori radicals and all of their followers who are taught a racist belief system in our schools and universities hit the streets and social media. They're out there accusing the government of breaching the Treaty of Waitangi. They accuse any white people who don't honour Māori as mana whenua or lords of the land as being white supremacists. Look, the reality is most New Zealanders of all ethnicities are sick to death of this separatist belief system, and that's why we have not one but two of the coalition partners of our three-tier government voted in to end it. However, the latest trend to creep into this racist belief system is to deny that the tribal chiefs who signed the Treaty of Waitangi in 1840 ceded sovereignty to the British Crown. People make these accusations even though 542 chiefs have their signatures on the Treaty of Waitangi that states that they did. Now, this wouldn't be so bad if it were just the radicals doing it. However, it's not just those people. It's the leader of the opposition, Chris Hipkins. He says it's clear they didn't cede sovereignty. It's some of the mayors of our major cities. It's coming out of the Waitangi Tribunal, and it's what's being taught in some of our schools. In fact, it's becoming so entrenched that Māori are superior to other New Zealanders that about 40,000 people marched on the New Zealand Parliament in November 2024 when one of the coalition parties wanted to assert equal rights for all New Zealanders. Obviously, this is a very dire situation for any nation to face. We have a belief system coming from academia and political parties that denies the legitimacy of our country. It's also astonishing that a growing percentage of the population who have been indoctrinated into this belief system do not believe in equal rights. So today I want to investigate these claims that the tribal chiefs didn't cede sovereignty in 1840, and I'm going to do it by analysing a recent podcast that featured Simon O'Connor and Professor Paul Moon, both of whom are academics with multiple degrees. O'Connor, who was also a politician in the National Party, chose to interview Moon as he recognised as one of New Zealand's leading historians and an expert in the Treaty of Waitangi. After all, he holds a Bachelor of Arts degree in History and Political Studies, a Master of Philosophy degree with distinction, a Master of Arts degree with honours, a PhD and a Doctor of Literature degree. In 2003, he was elected as Fellow of the Royal Historical Society at University College London and is also a Fellow of the Royal Society of Arts. So I guess if you're going to question anybody about the sovereignty of the nation, you would think that there would be no other person more qualified than him. Well, unfortunately, that appears to be wrong. Now, I don't know if Moon is a liar or perhaps he's captured by the racist leftist professors that surround him at AUT. And I don't know why that even though he has a Doctor of Literature degree, he doesn't seem to understand the meaning of simple English words. And here's the thing. What Moon says is very important because it's his words that are likely to influence the media, academia, and so the whole country. After all, who has the credentials to doubt his words? Look, I never really talk about my qualifications or experience, but I guess if I'm going to challenge Moon, and I am, well, for context, I suppose I should. Firstly, I'm not an academic, and judging by the absolute garbage that comes out of the many academics' mouths, I'm very happy that I wasn't exposed to that sort of indoctrination from our education system. Instead, I left Pororo College at 15, which was one of the country's lowest decile colleges. I had no qualifications. However, I completed an apprenticeship in metal fabrication, became a tradesman, and was one of the first to integrate computer-aided drafting and computer-aided manufacturing machines into engineering workshops in New Zealand. And as a result of that, I became the foreman of a large engineering workshop. I then did on-site installations all over New Zealand as a works manager. I became a sales engineer, a project manager, and finally, the national manager in a division of New Zealand's largest mechanical company. For 25 years, I managed an international licensee agreement with a major international corporation, along with entering into and completing thousands of profitable subcontract agreements with most of New Zealand's Tier 1 construction companies. That involved the importation of products from around the world, along with managing a manufacturing plant and installation teams all over New Zealand. And I have written exactly the same number of books on the Treaty of Waitangi as Moon, 2, and like his, mine are in the National Library System of New Zealand. What I'm trying to say is that I'm not a nobody. I do know how to do research. I do know how to analyze, apply critical thinking, and come up with solid theories and outcomes. However, unlike Moon, I am not hamstrung when it comes to the conclusions I come up with. So throughout this presentation, I want you to notice that I have done my own research and I have come up with my own conclusions, and I back them with facts. Whereas Moon is stuck smack bang in the center of two extremely biased institutions, the universities themselves and the Royal Historical Society. You will notice that Moon doesn't have facts, also that he doesn't even believe the words that people have said in the past. Instead, he puts his own spin on events and states that these things are probable or those things are not likely. Unlike Moon's books, me and my books are regularly attacked and featured on mainstream news. Why? Because I refuse to join their groupthink, and I'm brave enough to tell the truth about our history. And one thing I've noticed about the attacks that the media makes on me is that they interview teachers or librarians who are stuck in the same biased institutions that Moon is. And they never question any of the facts or references from my books. Instead, they attack me personally. They say that I'm being anti-Maori and that my books should be banned. Does anyone remember the last time a country went around burning the books? Now, I can handle it when people question my references, but being attacked on mainstream media for telling the truth tells me that there is something very wrong with the belief system that these people are buying into. Now, obviously, this is not a competition between Moon and me, but people, especially within the media and academic, will doubt that I can question Moon because I don't have a degree. But as I've shown, I'm a self-made man who, from meager beginnings, entered the workforce pretty much as a kid. I had to learn to operate in the real world, where mistakes can have major repercussions on a large company, or worse, kill people in factories or on work sites. I've had to extend my mind and challenge myself in ways that I'm sure that as a privileged academic, Moon probably hasn't. I think that we have a systemic problem with regards to relying on academics to do educate people, or the media to turn to them for information. You see, the issue is whether it's Don Brash on economics or Moon on history, their whole academic careers rely on groupthink, and their fields not moving on from incorrect papers published by them or peer-reviewed by them to get their PhDs. It's obvious that the fields of economics and history have gone backwards in the last 50 years. People are getting poorer, less productive, and these days, no one can even agree on what a simple document such as the Treaty of Waitangi means anymore. They've done this by changing the meaning of words. As an example, Moon, a historian with the highest qualifications, has tied himself to the narrative that Maori, a homogenous group, arrived in New Zealand sometime in the 14th century, and Pākehā, another homogenous group, arrived about 450 years later. And because, in his mind, Maori were here first, they are special and Pākehā aren't. He also believes that the Treaty of Waitangi was signed between two sovereign states, one Maori, the other Pākehā, or rather a brown first group of people and a second white group of people. I'd wager that almost all academics have this type of worldview. It's all based on racial identity. And so our history and politics devolves into identity politics. History loses context and it all becomes a kind of Marxist group fest, which is all about which group got here first and that power should be vested in them, regardless of actual history or even having a peaceful country. I believe that Moon's whole outlook on New Zealand's history and the signing of the 1840 treaty is mostly false. The first falsehood, and it's a big one, is that there were just two groups of people in New Zealand in 1840, Maori and Pākehā. Now, for an esteemed historian, I think that his lack of nuance is absolutely astounding. The tribes in New Zealand at that time were separate in every sense of the word. None of them, either singularly or collectively, were known as Maori in 1840. The collective noun Maori, grouping all the separate tribes or nations as one people, wasn't in any of the native dialects of the English language till sometime in the mid-1840s and wasn't well established until sometime in the 1850s. Now, this is important that we're accurate. Moon and others who group all of these separate tribes into one group have created a social construct that did not actually exist in 1840. And this matters because today we have groups of radicalized people hating Pākehā and taking the government to court, saying that the Maori, they were and still are being oppressed. You can see, if I can just grab the highlighter here, you can see that if we look at the Herbert Williams 1957 6th edition, a dictionary of the Maori language, which was based on the original dictionary of William Williams of 1844, you can see that the noun Maori, a person of the native race, says here, this use began about 1850. So it's pretty clear, and we have to be accurate about this. Maori meant normal, usual, or ordinary. And this is how the word Maori is used in the treaty. And here is some more evidence that Maori did not exist as a social construct in 1840. In all 8 sheets of the 1840 Ngāpuhi dialect treaty documents, the collective noun Māori with a capital M does not appear in any of them. So even though I didn't even sit school certificate English, I can see that. And isn't it astonishing that as a doctor of literature and an expert on the Treaty of Waitangi, Moon hasn't looked into this anomaly at all? The truth is, Māori are not even mentioned in the Treaty of Waitangi, and that's because the social construct didn't exist in 1840. The social construct Māori is a reasonably modern phenomenon that was manifested mostly in the 1850s by people who were ignorant about the various tribes who lived here or how or when they had arrived here. And also they had little idea about basic biology, i.e. there is no such thing in biological terms as race. And today, the word Māori has become a lazy and inaccurate political construct that uses racial themes to loosely group those who can trace an ancestor to one of those tribes into one group, known as Māori. If we are to live peacefully together, I think we need to ditch these racially charged themes of Māori and Pākehā. If people wish to identify tribally, well, then that's a different matter. Well, hi there, viewers. I just wanted to interrupt the presentation to take a moment of your time to promote a couple of really clever initiatives that I'm involved with. Firstly, a wonderful online subscription-based education initiative, which you can find at www.communityhealthnz.org. It's New Zealand's leading platform for education, health and well-being. At Community Health NZ, we believe education is the foundation of a united and resilient community. We ensure that the knowledge that we share is impactful, informative and empowering for all. Our platform is here to support individuals and communities with resources that inspire growth and raise living standards. You'll also find the Optimal Growth program on that platform, which features customized meal plans, workout programs for every level, muscle recovery programs, and much more. Join today and be part of a smarter, healthier, and more united New Zealand. Together we can close gaps in education and elevate our collective well-being. And secondly, I'm involved in the background of an exciting new political movement called Unite New Zealand Party, led by Lee Taitua. The exciting thing about this movement is that at its heart is a proposal for a written constitution. It defines the structure of government, it confines the powers of government, which is really important, and it refines the Constitution of New Zealand. Unite New Zealand Party is the only party that understands government monetary operations, and that will result in a new economic revival that lifts the poor and middle class to highs never before experienced in New Zealand. There are initiatives such as the removal of all taxes and the introduction of a single-scaled property tax, a guaranteed job paid at a minimum of 65k tax-free, pensions 65k tax-free, a 7-year debt jubilee. So these are just some of the initiatives that will not just be policies but embedded into the Constitution, because economic well-being is your right. It's not given to you by the government. You can find Unite New Zealand Party at www.unitenz.org. Thanks. And now back to the presentation. I believe it is this inaccurate and lazy kind of thinking that Moon and others have that is at the heart of the division and separatism that has been sewn into the fabric of this country. And I believe it is fueled by the two main political parties. It appears to me that they are foisting this division upon us through academia for a reason. And my guess is the reason they are doing it is to keep the mob with the pitchforks at bay from the 1%ers as they slowly strip us of our wealth. I'm talking about the BlackRocks here. That's the reason why Luxon, the leader of the National Party, the only party in the coalition not trying to end the division, is cuddling up to Larry Fink of BlackRock. What I get sick of is when I point this fact out, i.e. no one was known as a Maori in 1840 and Maori are not mentioned in the Treaty of Waitangi, I'm told that, oh, you're just playing with semantics. Everybody knows they were talking about Maori. Nope. If we're going to beat the racism and separatism in New Zealand, we need to be accurate about our history. Some of these groups were as separate as people could be. They arrived at different times. They had different skin colours, different hair colours, different languages, and some had very different cultures. You cannot label them as one people or a separate people to everyone else in New Zealand. They're individual human beings, no different to any other human being. Back to the treaty, which is what Moon is referring to in this podcast, which we'll look at shortly. The word used in the treaty was an adjective, Māori, with a small m. It meant ordinary, as opposed to something higher. And the something higher was rangatira, and that is how the word was used in the treaty. We see that in the Dictionary of the Maori Language, which was put together by some of the greatest linguists of the Polynesian language ever, such as William and Edward Williams, who translated the English draft of the treaty, which was then revised in 1917 by Herbert Williams, and that's still the 6th edition today. That Moon sees the Treaty of Waitangi as being between just two groups, Māori and Pākehā, instead of a treaty between the British Crown and hundreds of different groups, all made up of individuals, is beyond me. There was at least 600 different groups in New Zealand in 1840, including more than 2,000 Europeans. And James Busby's fourth final English draft, which, by the way, is the only one dated correctly on the correct watermark paper from his friend, US Consul James Clendon's house, and matches Te Tiriti perfectly, is addressed to all of the people of New Zealand without distinction. We'll come back to who these groups were a little later, but Moon fails to see that New Zealand has not one nation, but is a landmass with hundreds of separate nations dispersed from the top to the bottom. And what's more, no one knows which one of these nations came first, which blows their first hair are the special people theory out of the water. While almost none of these nations shared any sovereignty with other groups, when it comes to a discussion about whether any of these groups ceded sovereignty, for what could only be described, I suppose, as convenience, Moon fails to mention that some of these nations had been involved in the most horrific warfare against each other, including slavery and cannibalism, and that many of these groups were now extinct. Also, he fails to understand that the chiefs of each tribe would have had their own reasons for signing the treaty. Again, he rather bizarrely groups them all together and calls them one group, Maori. Despite no one in New Zealand going by that name at the signing of the Treaty of Waitangi, and that word not even being in the treaty. If you want to know what the treaty said, or that sovereignty was sought by the British and ceded by the chiefs, we just need to read it. I'll just read the preamble here. I'll grab my laser. Her Majesty Queen Victoria, Queen of England, in her gracious considerations for the chiefs and the people of New Zealand, that's everybody, and her desire to preserve them their land, which was because of the speculators coming here and buying them all, and to maintain peace and order amongst them, which is a reference to the musket wars that were going on here, has been pleased to appoint an officer to treat them with the cessation of sovereignty of their country and of the islands adjacent to them. So Moon doesn't believe these words. They're not in there. Article first, the chiefs of the Confederation of the United Tribes and other chiefs who have not joined this confederation cede to the Queen of England forever the entire sovereignty of their country. According to Moon, he doesn't believe those words. They're not there. And again in Article 3, in return for the cessation of sovereignty to the Queen, the people of New Zealand shall be protected by the Queen of England, and the rights and privileges of British subjects shall be granted to them. So Moon is denying that these words, the British wrote these words in here. That appears to be what he's doing. While we're talking about the James Busby English draft, I'm going to show you how the academics have tricked us into believing the Crown has breached the treaty, and so this becomes the basis of the whole treaty industry. Let's have a look at what Busby wrote and Hobson approved in the English, and then the translation of it by Henry and Edward Williams into the Ngāpuhi dialect. So firstly, if we look at the James Busby's final English draft, it was dated the 4th of February 1840. Article 2nd, this is what James Busby wrote. The Queen of England confirms and guarantees to the chiefs and tribes and to all the people of New Zealand the possession of their lands, dwellings, and all their property. Then go on to talk about how the chiefs of the Confederation can only sell land to the Queen. This is what the English wrote down: the possession of their lands, dwellings, and all their properties. This is what Henry and Edward Williams translated into the Ngāpuhi dialect. The writing's quite small, so I can't see all the words, but I'll try anyway. Ko te kuini ingarane ki wakariti, ki wakai, ki ngā rangatira, ki ngā hapu, ki ngā tangata katoa o nu tarini, te tino rangatira, o rātou whenua, o rātou kāinga, me o rātou taonga katoa. So what they're saying, the possession of their lands means te tino rangatira o rātou whenua. That's what they translated. And this is what Professor Hugh Kawharo said, no, this word means chiefly authority. And I suppose if the chiefs were the only one who had any authority to own anything, have possessions, well, it could be. But te tino rangatiratanga is used to swap out the words, the possessions. We even see in the modern dictionary down here, the word ownership is in there. So this is a really big trick. They've tried to tell you that the words "the possession of their lands" in the draft was translated into "chiefly authority of their lands," which is rubbish, isn't it? Now let's look briefly at who the groups were in New Zealand prior to 1840. Now this is of the utmost importance so we can understand what was going through the minds of the people who lived here and why they may or may not have ceded sovereignty. And to be clear, the words ceding sovereignty in this context was the giving of the right to govern the entire country to Her Majesty the Queen of England. Remember, Moon's view is that Maori arrived circa 1350 and he groups them all together as though they had all the same political will. And the truth, though, is that as far back as Edward Traeger's 1904 book, The Maori Race, we have known that other groups of people were here when the various different groups arrived during the 14th century. In fact, there's carbon dating evidence from the DSIR that people were in Pokawa, Hawke's Bay, hunting and cooking moa at least 7,170 years before 1969. Which of course means that Moon's view of the colonization of New Zealand and the Maori and that Maori are a homogenous group has just collapsed. In this context, the tribes that arrived in the 14th century are relatively new here when compared to the people that lived here more than 7,200 years ago. And we can see this DSIR evidence here 3,000 years ago, 7,000 years ago, and back in the late 60s, they were writing in the papers about these things, but it was all hushed up. There are hillside forts and amphitheatres and solar observatories right in front of our eyes that could not have been built by Maori. Rather, they mimic the ancient British hillside forts. New Zealand's history is so diverse, nuanced and interesting, which one would think is a marvellous thing for us to research, right? And here's some more of those hillside forts in New Zealand. Reminiscent of the Herefordshire forts, and there are many others I could put on there as well. There are about 5,000 of these sites in New Zealand north of Taupo, whereas in the whole of UK there are only about 3,300. So this supports the idea that there was a massive population in New Zealand at one point. So there are archaeological sites all over New Zealand that are the evidence that Moon's academic and warped sense of history is out of step with reality. There is DSIR carbon dating evidence of a civilization before the people Moon calls Maori were here. There is DNA evidence from Monaka Matamua that her tribe, Ngāti Hotu, originated in what was called Persia. They had red hair, pale skin and green eyes. There's evidence of a cover-up in the late 1960s of all these archaeological finds. Here's the evidence here. A number of allowed their names to be associated with a secret statement of belief marked across the top, restricted, not for publication. So the true history of New Zealand is one of continual colonization by various groups of humans over many thousands of years. However, for political reasons and terribly racist legislation, I'm talking about the Treaty of Waitangi Act, our most eminent historians and academics deny any of it and come out with the most outrageous claims.
But the key thing is, what did the British want? Did they want Maori sovereignty? And every single document that deals with this, from the British Colonial Office, from the British Treasury leading up to the treaty, says no. In fact, all the documents dealing with this make it very clear Britain wanted full sovereignty over its subjects living in New Zealand.
He just stated that every single document that deals with whether the British sought sovereignty in New Zealand that came from the British Colonial Office and the British Treasury says no, the British did not seek sovereignty in New Zealand. Now, either that's a barefaced lie or he hasn't read the most important document that you could read if you wanted to know whether the British sought sovereignty over New Zealand in 1840. And it came out of the Colonial Office on the 14th of August, 1839. It was Lord Normanby's written instructions to Hobson regarding the conditions that must be met before New Zealand could become a British colony. It was that document that was the source document from which the Treaty of Waitangi was drafted by James Busby and that Hobson approved. And it states very clearly in the preamble in Article 1 and in Article 3 that it is the cessation of sovereignty that the British wanted so they could protect the people of New Zealand. How can Moon not see that Normanby's instructions, which I'll read in a moment, states that to protect anyone in New Zealand, they needed sovereignty or the right to govern? Although Normanby initially stated in the 14th August 1839 instructions, as Moon said, that since the advice from the Committee of the House of Commons in 1836, Britain had not thought it appropriate to colonise New Zealand. That's true. However, in the same instructions, it states that as a result of the more than 2,000 British people that were living here by 1838 and who were living without law, buying up all the land and generally causing trouble, they had changed their mind. I'll read just one passage from the instructions to Hobson from the Secretary of the State, Lord Normanby. He begins with, believing, however, that their own welfare, it's the natives, would, under the circumstances I have mentioned, be best promoted by the surrender to Her Majesty of a right, that's their sovereignty, now so precarious and little more than nominal, and persuaded that the benefits of British protection and laws administered by the British judges would by far more than compensate for the sacrifice by the natives of a national independence which they are no longer able to maintain, Her Majesty's government have resolved to authorise you to treat with the Aborigines of New Zealand in their recognition of Her Majesty's sovereign authority over the whole or any part of these islands which they may be willing to place under Her Majesty's dominion. So it clearly states in Lord Normanby's instructions to Hobson that Her Majesty's government authorises him to treat the Aborigines of New Zealand to recognise Her Majesty's sovereign authority over the whole of the country. But Moon states no. He says all the evidence indicates that they didn't want sovereignty. What the hell is wrong with Moon's logic? I even got a slide from one of Moon's own presentations that is a copy of a letter the day after Lord Normanby's instructions, where Lord Normanby is responding to Hobson's point that the South Island was mostly uninhabited. Normanby states, the assertion on the grounds of discovery of Her Majesty's sovereign rights, that's the right to govern, over the island. So it says it on there. How could Moon possibly maintain that the British did not seek sovereignty of the entire country, including the Aborigines, when he is on record of stating it himself? In an earlier video, I used an AI large language model to analyse Lord Normanby's entire 4,500 word instructions to Hobson for any evidence that Moon could be correct. And there is none. Actually, the evidence that Normanby instructed Hobson to have the chiefs cede sovereignty is that Hobson carried out Lord Normanby's instructions by having James Busby write in Article 1 of the treaty that the chiefs are to cede the entire sovereignty of their country to the Queen of England. But Moon is oblivious to the simplest of facts written in the treaty itself. So we now have in the instructions from Her Majesty's government through Normanby that Aborigines were to cede sovereignty to Her Majesty so they could protect them. In Hobson's January 30th, 1840 proclamation, it stated Her Majesty's sovereignty would be extended to any part of New Zealand that they acquired. We have the Treaty of Waitangi addressed to all the people of New Zealand, had it written in it multiple times that the chiefs are to cede sovereignty of their entire country. 542 chiefs signed the Treaty of Waitangi, and by their actions and speeches immediately after the signing, they ceded sovereignty. Then on May 21st, 1840, Captain Hobson proclaimed full sovereignty over the entire country. But Moon is denying that any of that happened, which is serious because it's his narrative which is likely to permeate through New Zealand's education facilities. What on earth's going on? This warped belief system that he has is very destabilising for our whole country. And I would wager that it's precisely this sort of academic nonsense that encourages Māori radicals and their poorly educated followers to leave their schools, universities, and workplace to protest when a coalition party is voted in by the people to ensure that, as per Article 3 of the Treaty of Waitangi, all the citizens should have equal rights in New Zealand.
In fact, all documents dealing with this make it very clear Britain wanted full sovereignty over its subjects living in New Zealand, not over everyone. In fact, there's one document, I think, from March 1839, where the British government says, we want sovereignty, a treaty to give us sovereignty over Anglo-Saxons who've gone to live in New Zealand. It's that explicit. Other documents say we want sovereignty over our subjects who've gone to live in New Zealand. So not only is it unlikely that Maori believed they were ceding sovereignty, but the British didn't want it. So the matter's sort of settled there. The chiefs didn't cede sovereignty, the British didn't seek it. And this remained in play roughly till about 1843.
So the matter is settled then. Despite Moon quoting from documents many months prior to the instructions that went to Hobson, which is the only document one needs to read if one is trying to find out if the British sought sovereignty in New Zealand, and despite him not coming up with any other evidence that sovereignty wasn't sought or ceded, Moon states again, it's that explicit. He states, not only is it unlikely that Māori thought they were ceding sovereignty, but the British didn't want it. The matter is not settled at all. Moon has no idea what's in the head of each of the different chiefs who represented their own groups that signed the Treaty of Waitangi in 1840. What's not just unlikely but is downright false is that Māori were just one group, as Moon is trying to make out.
But so much is made, Paul, of, amongst other things, Hobson's claim, we are now one people. And the article which extends, if you will, British, is it citizenship or rights onto all in New Zealand, which I think some have taken to include settlers and Māori. So is there any sort of context or commentary around those?
Well, the first point about what Hobson said at Waitangi, that we're all one people, that's a summary of how he saw certain things at certain times. Bear in mind, the vast majority of the chiefs never heard that. Over 90% of the signatories never heard that statement made. So it's not as though it was widely known, certainly not binding.
So Moon just brushes it off as if he doesn't care what Hobson thought or said at Waitangi, which is astounding. Because on the one hand, he states that the British did not seek sovereignty or the right to govern the entire country. But when the representative of the British, Hobson, makes a statement that confirms the British wanted to govern the entire country with all of its citizens being treated equal, he states that it wasn't binding. And then he states, and besides, over 90% of the chiefs or signatories didn't hear Hobson say it. So he failed to answer the question from O'Connor, which means he has no explanation as to why Hobson said those words if he didn't mean them. Can you see how Moon is trying to twist the words that we know that Hobson said? It's true, there were 46 chiefs who signed the treaty on February 4th, 1840 at Waitangi, and that's only about 8.5% of the total signatories. However, there were around 500 natives and 200 settlers, which is a total of about 700 people at Waitangi. That Hobson said, we are now one people, or he iwi tai tātou, as each chief stepped up, is just another damning piece of evidence that Moon is either illogical or is just making things up, which surely means his academic career should be destroyed. And it's his words that can't be trusted.
Where there really wasn't any choice. The number of settlers was growing to over 1,000 in the late 1830s. And they were beyond the reach of British law. And this is a crucial point. Because they were beyond the reach of British law, it meant that those communities, those Pākehā communities in New Zealand in the late 1830s were scarred by lawlessness. There's no question about that.
So Moon states that in the late 1830s, the number of settlers was over 1,000. Well, this is inaccurate or a mistake. In Lord Norby's instructions, it states that at the commencement of 1838, which was 2 years earlier, there were more than 2,000 settlers in New Zealand. And while the estimates are that by 1841 there were more than 5,000 settlers, that would mean that the number of settlers around when the treaty was signed would be more like 2,500 or 3,000 people, or double the amount of people in the average tribe in New Zealand, although some were bigger and some were smaller. Moon thinks this number is insignificant, but only because he groups all the different tribes together, which is precisely why he has a warped sense of history. Lord Norby's instructions do make it clear that amongst the settlers there are some persons of bad and doubtful character who do not answer to any law or tribunal. But before the treaty, living without law was the case for everyone living in New Zealand. Without a central government, there were no laws, and so no one had any rights at all. So the committers of acts of infanticide, slavery, murder, and cannibalism also faced no law or tribunal. You can see Moon's extreme bias because he failed to mention that in the same document, Normanby also stated the following: the natives, composed of numerous dispersed and petty tribes who possess few political relations to each other and are incompetent to act or even deliberate in concert, and that because of the growing number of settlers, the chiefs could no longer maintain any sovereignty. That's yet more evidence that Moon's view of Maori being one group in 1840 is completely wrong. The British Secretary of State for the Colonies describes the separate tribes as dispersed, that they possess few political relations to each other and do not deliberate in concert. So as a top historian, Moon and others who hold this view surely have to drop this notion that in 1840 there are just two signatories to the treaty, Maori and the British Crown.
To believe that, you'd have to believe that 542 chiefs decided, we've had enough. We've had enough of running our hapu. We've had enough of being in power. We're going to hand over all our authority to this tiny group of immigrants. They can run us. That seems improbable. So how do we explain it?
Moon is just making stuff up. And again, he's doing it as if Maori were one group capable of collectively making concerted decisions about their future. He has the context of what's going on in New Zealand at the time completely wrong. He has not thought about the smaller tribes wanting the Queen's protection from the bigger tribes. He's not thought about the land loss the natives were suffering because many chiefs were selling their land for peanuts or selling it multiple times. He has not thought about the fact that as a result of constant war, the population had dropped and that the number of men was dangerously low. He's not thought about the impact of slavery and cannibalism was having on the smaller tribes. He's not thought about the attempts of annexation of parts of New Zealand by the French. By signing the Treaty of Waitangi, the chiefs did not cede their tribal authority in 1840. They each ceded to the Queen the right for the Queen to govern over the entire country. In Article 3 of the treaty, tangata Maori, or ordinary people, as opposed to the chiefs, gained not only the same rights as British subjects, but they had gained the same rights as chiefs. What they had done is agreed to move away from the population sapping ways of tribalism to a centrally governed country, and doing so gained the protection of the most powerful nation in the world at the time, the British. And if you read history, as I have, that is so obvious it should be really difficult to argue against it. Yet by twisting words, ignoring other words and documents, Moon is not only argues against these facts, but he's conjured up a belief system that is entirely against reality. And the horrifying reality is that it is Moon's anti-reality belief system that is taught in our schools. And so as we wrap up today's episode of Andy Oakley Investigates, we've explored the complex narrative around the Treaty of Waitangi and the question of sovereignty in New Zealand. It's clear from our discussion that the historical interpretations by academics like Professor Paul Moon raises significant questions about how we understand our past. The evidence points to a very different story than what Moon and others often teach or is assumed. Lord Normanby's instructions to Captain Hobson are explicitly aimed at securing sovereignty for Britain over New Zealand. This contradicts claims that such sovereignty was neither sought or ceded. The language in the treaty itself, along with the actions and speeches following its signing, further support this. We've also seen that the idea of Maori as a single cohesive group in 1840 doesn't hold up with when we look at the historical context. The tribes were diverse, often in conflict and without collective political cohesion, which challenges the notion that they could have unanimously decided on issues such as sovereignty. This discussion isn't just academic. It touches at the heart of our national identity and the current socio-political debates in New Zealand. Understanding our history accurately is crucial for moving forward as a united nation where all citizens are treated with equality under the law regardless of their ethnicity. When we are accurate about our past, the identity politics fades into the distance and we get a better understanding of who we are as a nation of individuals who are governed, but at any one time we will almost never agree on anything. So thank you for joining me on this journey through our history. Let's keep questioning, keep learning, and keep striving for the truth and unity of our beautiful country. Until next time, this has been Andy Oakley.